There are different audiences. So much of how you talk depends on your audience, and you're going to have a different audience for the website and social media, and a different format in an email, and a different sort of business goal with each of those. So again, it's looking at the intersection of business and user.
Welcome to the Agents of Change, the podcast experience you've been waiting for your entire marketing career. Search, social, mobile, AI, blockchain, and neuromarketing. These are the Agents of Change, and so are you. Digital marketing success awaits, and your transformation begins now.
Welcome to the Agents of Change podcast, the podcast that's all about helping you reach and engage your ideal customers online, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. My name is Rich Brooks, and I'm your host. This is episode 620, powered by Flight New Media. What comes first, the content or the design? No, this isn't some paradoxical riddle. It's a challenge every one of us is going to face multiple times in our careers. As someone who's been designing and building websites for nearly 3 decades, I've seen it go both ways. But after today's conversation, we may have a winner. But before I get to that, I wanted to share something that I accomplished this week with AI. I had received a spreadsheet of all the attendees for a presentation I gave, which included their name, company, and email address. Now, I didn't want to just add them to our email list at Flight because they hadn't opted in, and that's not how we do things over here. But I did want to follow up with them. I decided that I would reach out and try connecting with each one of them on LinkedIn, but after it took me 15 minutes to track down just the first person because they had such a similar common-sounding name, I realized that this was going to be a task that was going to take me way too long. So I opened up Claude Cowork, which is the agentic tool within Claude, and I asked it if it could help me track down all the LinkedIn accounts for the people in the spreadsheet. It said sure, and went to work. About 3 minutes later, I had an updated spreadsheet with a new column of LinkedIn profile URLs. It had found 49 out of the 61 people on that list at LinkedIn. Now, I haven't confirmed that each one is correct, but the first batch of people that I've reached out to, it was all perfect. If you're not leveraging the power of agentic AI, you might be falling behind. Even if you're not falling behind, you're doing a lot of grunt work that you can delegate to free up more of your time for strategic thinking. We've done a few posts or a few episodes recently about agentic AI, Claude Cowork in specifics, so go back and listen to a few of those episodes. Now, let's shift gears to this week's topic, all about content and design. My next guest is a content strategist, author, and creator of the trademarked Content First framework. She helps CMOs and product leaders eliminate meaning drift, align teams around shared language, and scale messaging without losing clarity. Host of the Content First podcast and author of Content First Design and the forthcoming Meaning at Scale. She works in the intersection of structure, strategy, and execution, turning content into infrastructure that drives speed and growth. Today, we are going to be talking about aligning your content with user experience and business goals with Sarah Johnson. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you for having me.
So the intersection of structure, strategy, and execution is an interesting one. What was your journey in getting there?
My journey started in user experience, where I wrote the book Content First Design. And as I began to think more and more about it, as I progressed with the business, I extrapolated the idea to an organizational level, and I began to see how meaning disintegrates or fragments across the content stream of people, different teams, channels, and materials. So structure, UX, I think that content determines structure. We start there. And in order to create a structure that has meaning, we need to be consistent with meaning across marketing, product, and user experience.
All right. So would you say that you started from a place of writing and then that kind of fed into your sense of UX and design?
Absolutely. I started as a novelist and I still do that. And I got into user experience through a friend and fell in love with it. And I love content design and I love thinking about it and finding ways to improve like processes, frameworks, models. And that's what led me to sort of this meaning at scale concept of how can we maintain meaning and clarity across an organization and across teams and channels so that we don't confuse the user, so that we don't push away customers, so that we don't lose brand trust.
All excellent reasons. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because, as I mentioned to you offline, we're in the process of redesigning our website, and some of the content's going to stay the same, some of it's going to change, and I'm writing that now. And after running a agency for nearly 29 years that develops websites, we've certainly gone through the gamut of what should come first, content or design. And so I'm super excited to kind of dive in to this topic with you. So when people build websites or digital experiences, they often start with design or layout, like we talked about. Why do you believe that content should come first instead?
Oh, to me, it's a no-brainer. To me, a digital product is a conversation with the user. And how can you have that conversation if you don't know how they talk, think, feel, or what they're going to do on a page, what they're looking for, what their needs are? So researching content and understanding that conversation is going to feed into design. Like saying that doesn't mean that I think content should run the show. I think it's a very collaborative process with product, business, and UX. And user research, especially because we're really digging into who this user is before we create the conversation. And a friend of mine, Melinda Belcher, said that not having the user conversation is like trying to make a movie without a script. How are you going to get people talking? And I think that design first, we don't really know what the user's looking for. We don't really know how they're understanding the flow through the conversation of the experience.
So since research needs to come first, let's touch on that. What does research look like for you? If you're working with a client, what kind of research are you doing to better understand the language of the customer and the kind of questions they would ask, and even what their journey might be like?
That's a great question. The research, there's some wonderful ways to do customer research. One of my favorite was listening into the customer support center, to the call center, to hear what people were calling and complaining about, what their pain points were, and how they spoke about the experience they were having, what their language was, what they understood about how we said things and what they didn't understand, what was clear and what was unclear. If I do this action, is it permanent? Can it be undone? Things like that. And also conversation mapping, where we talk to people and play sort of devil's advocate and look for their pain points, listen to how they talk, think, feel, which brings us to an empathy map, which is literally you run a customer through a digital experience and capture how they talk about it, what they think of what they're doing, how they feel about it, and what they say. So you're understanding a lot about who this person is, who these customers are, and gathering a lot of data that's invaluable. Those are a few examples.
So we do this research and we feel that we have a pretty good sense of what our customers and prospects are interested, their pain points, their desires. How does that translate into your content first model? What are the next steps after that?
Sure. The next steps, the content first model that I use starts with sort of the team alignment. The second step is the research. The third step is doing the design. And that's working with product, UX, and content. And content works very closely with user experience design. And the idea is to first do a content priority map where you establish the hierarchy of content on the page, and you work with a designer to create a really clear, simplified experience for people to navigate and find their way through and to understand what they need to do, what that means, and why it matters.
So you mentioned a step that came even before research, and I didn't realize that, the team alignment. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. We need to align on the problem we're trying to solve for the user. And in my book, I talk about having a problem statement workshop. We don't want to be given a solution. We want to be given a problem to solve. So understanding what that problem is across teams is critical. Understanding how we're going to talk about it is critical. So that alignment is iterative. Like the more we learn, the more we can refine that problem statement and have everybody on board speaking the same language. So that happens in meetings and, a variety of communication channels.
All right. So if you start with the content first, how does that change the way that these teams then think about the user experience?
I think that the focus becomes more on the user and more on creating a conversation. And I think it simplifies it. You're not designing in the dark. You're not designing for what you think a user might do. It's not so me driven. It's more who are we serving and how can we best serve them? And finding that sweet spot, which is the biggest thing, is between business requirements and user needs. When you hit that sweet spot, that's your jackpot.
All right. So I'm sure there are a lot of people listening right now who are not in the middle of a website redesign. So how can this content first approach apply to their day-to-day marketing, such as email, social media, and so on?
Sure. I think that the first thing they need is team alignment. How are they talking, especially across channels, about the same thing? Are they using the same language for the same thing, or are they interpreting the same thing differently? So if you call it a dog in an email, you better call it a dog in your social media and not a cat or not a canine.
Right. So the language in your mind is very important and to be consistent across these different channels. But at the same time, some of these channels have different vibes. The LinkedIn is not the same as X, is not the same as Facebook.
Right.
How much flexibility do you build into this? Or are there core things like, if we're going to call it a dog, then we're going to call it a dog everywhere, but you can have the flexibility of saying big dog, small dog. And I think,
sure. Absolutely. It can be a different kind of dog. If we're talking about, say, stock transactions, there are different kinds of stock transactions. There are different audiences. So much of how you talk depends on your audience, and you're going to have a different audience for the website and social media, and a different format in an email, and a different sort of business goal with each of those. So again, it's looking at the intersection of business and user.
I was just going to say, I've definitely over the years run into situations with clients where they say, I don't know how to write to a blank page. I need to see the designs and then I can write to them. What would you say to that client?
Do your research. You need to understand your customer. If you don't understand your customer and who they are and what they're looking for, how are you going to best serve them? And I think that you need to start with some words. You don't have to have the refined language, but at least an articulation that's enough to create a hierarchy of information and a sense of what the language will be.
All right. Now, a lot of people listening may not have a dedicated content strategist on their team or a UX team for that matter. If we are running a lean operation, how can we apply some of these content first principles with limited access or limited resources rather?
Sure. I encourage, when doing the customer research, I teach a class at Bentley in which we do customer research amongst teams. I have pods of 3 or 4 people, and they do research. I call it guerrilla testing. They do it within their group. They practice conversation mapping with each other. You be the customer, I'll be the business. And to find people in your environment who aren't on the project to test it with. It can be your mother, it can be your friend, it can be someone in the business who isn't familiar with the project that you're doing, but to find ways of testing, to get creative with who you're testing with and how you're doing it.
So one of the things we kind of teased when we were talking about the different social channels and email and how there's a little bit of variance there. You've talked about meaning drift. Can you define what meaning drift is and why it's so important?
Sure. Meaning drift is when a message is fragmented across an organization, meaning Rich says it one way, product says it another, marketing says it another, and UX is left sort of trying to sort through what the message is and how it's best serving the customer. And that's one of the reasons I think the content designers and product need to be more involved in where the message originates, whether it's in the C-suite, in marketing, heads of marketing. But to be involved from the beginning would be an ideal world, to really put content first and understand the user. And the messaging, like what are we trying to accomplish with the words that we're using?
So if I'm running a small business and I notice that marketing is talking about a product in one way and sales is talking about it another way and distribution is talking about it in a third way, what are some of the ways that I can get everybody to be using the same language without necessarily micromanaging them? How do I decide what are the key messages that we want to get across and make sure that everybody is always using that same vernacular?
I think it has to start with marketing, whether it's a CMO or a head of marketing, and work with the marketing team. The marketing team needs to align with product and user experience and have those conversations. Why this message? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to us? And come to sort of a meeting of the minds of what we're trying to accomplish with this message, and is it going to succeed?
There was a time back in the day when I wrote all of Flight's content and all of Agents of Change content. Those days are long behind me, and I have a team now, and we all share in some of those writing responsibilities, as well as different people managing different channels. I'm sure there are some inconsistencies. What are your recommendations about trying to find and fix these inconsistencies, and how much effort should we be putting into some of the older messaging that's out there?
Well, I think putting effort into older messaging that's out there is really important in terms of like keeping things relevant and up to date. I think one of the ways I do it is a content clarity audit. I don't want to promote myself here, but a content clarity audit kind of goes through and analyzes where your content is experiencing meaning drift, where you're losing consistency, where you need to update content. Are you stating what you do from the beginning and who your typical customer should be, what their next steps are, what you're selling? Go through like that analysis.
All right. So there are certain things. And one of the things that I'm thinking about right now is here at Flight, and we talk about measurement, we talk about analytics, we talk about reporting, we talk about measurement, marketing. There's a lot of different phrases that kind of all mean, if not exactly the same thing, very similar things. How would we determine what the right terminology is? Is this a situation where we might do a survey of some of our clients and say, which of these phrases resonate to you, or do you even know what they mean? And then have that help us decide what the single phrase that we should be using is to avoid that meaning drift?
I think that's a great idea because you read my mind. What you want is what's going to resonate with customers, and then you want the consistency throughout the experience so they understand what you're talking about and what you're doing, what they're supposed to do.
And how does that meet up with, sometimes companies want to brand their framework or brand their way of doing things. How do we find the balance between those things? Like I've heard some people call it measurement marketing, and then the customer may not know what that actually means, even though they may have a vague sense of it. Is there a point where maybe we try and force our jargon or language on our customer base because we want to brand something, or is that never really a good idea?
That is an interesting question, and you're making me think, which I like. I think those words that you're introducing are important, and I think it requires a lot of training the user to understand. And you can do that through social media. I do it on LinkedIn to talk about meaning drift. Who knows what meaning drift is or meaning
right. Yeah, good point.
So I spend a lot of time sort of educating and talking about it and putting a frame around it, how this will help a business. And I just started publishing on LinkedIn what you get with an analysis, with a content clarity audit. Like, what does this mean? What does this meaning drift mean? What does it look like on a page?
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's a challenge because on one hand, we want to own that space and we want to define it so that people always think of Sarah Johnson when they hear the phrase meaning drift. And at the same time, there is a certain amount of work that you need to put in to make that phrase stick in the minds of your audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's sort of what brought me to writing the book, Meaning at Scale, is just to explore those concepts with a readership.
So AI is everywhere, obviously, and it's playing a bigger role in content creation. How might a content-first approach help organizations use AI more effectively, in your opinion?
I think it's huge. I think that content first provides structure, which AI needs. It provides context, tone of voice, style guide, lexicon, vernacular. The structure and context that AI needs has to come first. The language has to come first, and setting up how we talk about what we do. And I spent a lot of time building a chat GPT called Sage GPT that has that contextualization to think like me. And you feed it a lot of information and it can create content that sounds like me, but that I have to go over. It's sort of a first draft machine. And it's fun. I think if you do AI correctly, it's really fun. And I think content first can help you get there to the point where what you're spitting out isn't hallucinations. It's actual usable content.
I completely agree. We're in the early processes of building out what we call brand GPTs for different clients that are trained up on their ICPs or their ideal client personas, as well as their brand voice, which comes from documents that they have already written. And I also created, you call yours Sage, I created Orbi, which is my optimized self as well, so that, I can use it for first drafts and ideation and just to bounce ideas off of. And one of the things that I found through the experience of building these GPTs for clients has been that it's kind of like holding up a mirror to the brand. And it forces you to start saying, like, do we talk like this? Which is the right kind of phrase that we want to use? And like you said, it forces a structure upon you, not in a bad way, but in a way where you're like, oh, I have been using 3 or 4 different ways of describing the same product or the same service or output. And for me and for the clients I've worked with, it's actually clarified what their brand voice is and how they engage with their audience.
And it's a fabulous collaborator in that sense. And I look at it, the tool, I love collaborating with my AI. It's my collaboration buddy. But, like you said, you can run ideas by it. It's going to point out to you where you're adrift and where your messaging is working and why. And, obviously it takes a human eye. I mean, we all have to review what that thing says, or who knows what's going to happen. But I think that it's a hugely valuable tool in content creation.
Absolutely. So when you're building out your GPTs or using AI, what do things like style guides, terminology, and content standards, how does that fit into either building out the GPTs or just in terms of interacting with them?
I think building it out, it's sort of like what you said with the brand. You feed it the brand that the company has already built. I think that you can sort of feed the AI and train it with the style guide, the voice of the customer, the tone that you speak in, all those documents, the lexicon, all those documents you've been creating for years, and iterating on can go right in there. And you'll see with the output you get where you need to refinement. Like you said, it is a mirror for the work.
Do you think it's easier for a fairly new company to do this kind of work where they can kind of decide how they're going to sound, or for a company that's been established and may have a lot of copy to look back on, but maybe their voice has evolved over time?
That's interesting. One of the things with a small company is it's easier to pivot to AI, whereas large companies, you get into change management and a lot of hands in the pie and huge expense. And it's harder to manage change. There's resistance to change. There's training that has to happen. There's money that needs to be spent. So it's harder to sort of, for a larger organization to pivot, but they all are trying.
Absolutely. We've talked about content first. We've talked about UX, and we've talked about the customer journey to a certain degree. When it comes to this content first model, what are some of the things that you've heard from other experts or that people generally think about, creating content that you're like, that's just completely wrong, and you've got a very different opinion?
Well, I think starting with design is completely wrong. So anyone who tells me they're a design first organization, I'm just like, please.
Excellent.
This is why that's not going to work. And you can tell when you look at a site, it's a really groovy, beautiful, funky, and you don't know what it does or who the customer is or where you're supposed to start or what the story is.
Right. So finding that content first also helps with that clarity of message as well. If somebody's listening right now and they're feeling inspired and they want to improve the way that their business is using content to connect with customers, what's the very first step you would recommend they take?
They want to use content first to get to their customers. I think getting team alignment on what they're trying to accomplish and what the problem is they're trying to solve, and then doing the research into that problem with the customer.
Awesome. Sarah, this has been really helpful. If people are listening right now and they want to learn more about you, or they think that you can help them fix their issues with meaning drift and some of their content issues, where can we point them?
Sure. You can go to contentfirstdesign.com or email me at sarah@contentfirstdesign.com.
Awesome. And we'll have those links in the show notes. Sarah, thank you so much for solving this lifelong debate. And going forward, it's always going to be content first.
Thank you so much, Rich. It's been a pleasure.
For a full transcript of my conversation with Sarah, along with the audio, along with a blog post about everything I learned and all the links that she shared with us, just head on over to our website at theagentsofchange.com/620. It's all there. It's all free. While you're there, go ahead and subscribe to the show if you haven't already. Now, as I look back on our conversation or my conversation with Sarah, here was my takeaway. Is that the best websites don't start with a color palette or a wireframe, even though those are critical components. They start with a conversation worth having. When you know what you want to say and who you're saying it to, everything else falls into place. That's the content-first mindset of an agent of change.
Don't miss another thrilling episode of the Agents of Change podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform.